This morning's topic is challenging. Yes, John, it's not about having fun. Actually, it's about next month's theme, about activism. So I'm just starting us a little early. It's challenging, so please be prepared to get a little uncomfortable. They say that if there is no discomfort, there's no learning. For those of you who come from Alabama, I have nothing against the place of Alabama. I want you to keep your good memories of it. What I'm speaking of is something much more than Alabama. In late April this year, when some of my friends found out I'm going to Alabama, they say, "Why?" I told them I wasn't going to be a tourist. I was going to be part of Zen Peacemaker International's pilgrimage, bearing witness to racism in America. Buddhism and Unitarian Universalism teach us to learn from direct experience. Bearing witness is one of those ways to gain such direct experience. Maya Angelou said, "There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. Bearing witness is often a way to let the story out so we can build empathy, support, and lighten our emotional burden. Being witnessed is to be validated. Once the story is told, it will be carried by others. This is how memory and history live on." From Zen Buddhist peacemaker order, bearing witness is more than simply observing the situation like a tourist. But we become the situation. We become intimate with whatever it is: hunger, poverty, discrimination, disease, or death. To bear witness, we need to set aside our thoughts and analysis and enter a place of stillness and receptivity. Spiritually, this is how we become interconnected with our life as a whole. We have a motto, which is, "Be there and be empty." This means to be fully present and let go of what we know. From this unknowing place, we can accept the stories as they are. On this trip, before every stop, we as a group would do a sitting meditation to bring ourselves to the present moment and empty our mind to prepare to receive the gift of the story. My first stop on this trip is Birmingham. Oh, there you go. This first picture is, you probably are very aware of this one, 16th Street Baptist Church. On September 15, 1963, a KKK group set off a bomb here and killed 4 little girls who were in the church preparing for Sunday service. That was just one of many bombings that took place in Birmingham in those years. Okay. What happened? There it is. Maybe you need to control this. I'm trying to control these slides. Anyway, the second picture is the Kelly Ingram Park, which is next to the church. This park became famous because of the mass beating of freedom riders in the same year after the church bombing. They turned the dogs and fire hose on the marchers. They then round them up and put them in jail. Many of them were children. Tracing the bombing history, we drove through an area called Dynamite Hill. Before Birmingham got on the map of civil rights movement, Center Street was the dividing line where the blacks could only live on the east side and the whites live on the west side. When some black professionals tried to move to the west side, whites would burn down the doors of the houses they were planning to buy, and then followed by throwing dynamite along the street. We drove by a part of the town where blacks live. This is where all the factories are located. The soil was contaminated with toxic chemicals. Then they pulled a rail line through the neighborhood. People used to joke that when they go to the supermarket that's far from the neighborhood, they will have to bring a spoon because the ice cream would have melted by the time they get home. With a heavy heart, I drove down to Selma to join my pilgrimage group. Next slide. In Selma, our group took a walk across Edmund Pettus Bridge, where protesters marched toward Montgomery for voting rights in 1965. Most of these marchers were children trained to follow MLK's nonviolence movement. Many of them were 12, 13, and 14 years old. There are 3 marches. The first one was on March 7. The police used tear gas and baton and to stop the 600 unarmed marchers. Next slide. I saw a picture of this white sheriff holding an electric cattle prod that was used to assault the marchers from their behind. The second one was on March 9, which was cut short because of court injunction. The third march took place on March 21st. The march finally got to Montgomery on March 24th. It was 54 miles of journey. As I walk across the bridge, I picture these young girls and boys on foot, armed with nothing but their yearning for freedom. Next slide. Following the marchers, we came upon a farm that was the only place they were allowed to stay. By March 21st, the numbers grew to the thousands. They slept on the frozen ground or in the barn with the animals. Neighbors, community gathered whatever they had to feed the marchers. Remember, in those days, blacks could not just stop anywhere to use the bathroom, to eat or sleep. This farm belonged to a black farmer who took a lot of risks to open up his land for the marchers. We met with his daughter and granddaughter. We listened to their stories. In their soft voice, they said they just want to make sure the truth come out. Next slide. In December that same year, many white landowners evicted their black sharecroppers from their houses because they have attempted to register to vote as a result of the Voting Rights Act that was signed by President Johnson that same year. Student volunteers set up the tent city. This is where that place located on Highway 80, despite white threats and harassment. For the next 2 years, they helped resettle displaced black workers from this base. While we're in Selma, we met with 2 groups of foot soldiers who were young marchers in 1965. Next slide. We met at both the Tabernacle and the Brown Chapel, which was the staging center for the march. Listening to these now elderly recounting their experiences moved me. Tears came down their faces, but they had no hatred or bitterness because of their faith. As I listened to their stories, I could not help but wonder if I would be so brave as a preteen and ended up in the march and risking my life. Watching them telling the story made me wonder if this is like asking the rape victim to recount their trauma. My heart broke. At the end of our gathering, I asked one of the elders if he was hopeful in our current state of country. He took a deep breath and said, no. Standing outside Brown Chapel, a young black girl stopped and talked to us. She said she could not wait to get out of town. She said, this town is dead. I was reminded this was what the tour guide said about Birmingham. When whites move away, the town hollows out, and there is no more new development or social services. I remember the images of a lot of empty buildings with murals on the wall. Our third stop was the city of Montgomery. We spent a lot of time in the Legacy Museum. This is a one-of-a-kind museum that houses detailed history of slaveries and mass incarceration of black people. I saw the images of African slaves, heard the water as if I was in the boat with them. There were several rooms displayed, next slides, glass jars stacking from floor to ceilings. These 800 jars contained the soil collected from where a black person was lynched. There were several rooms where they showed enlarged newsprints of lynching announcement. What got to me the most was there's also seeing the advertisement of soda pop, popcorn, and candy. And they say, adults and children are all welcome. This actual last words of the lynching victims was on the wall too, haunted me for days. The museum also traced the economics of the slavery and show how wealth is being accumulated through the trading of slaves. Slaves' owner could borrow money using their assets of slaves as collateral. This will be what we call now mortgage-backed security. The insurance company also sold policy based on the value of these slaves as commodities. After a while, I could not breathe. I had to get out of the museum. I didn't take any pictures like a tourist would normally do in the museum. I felt as if I was witnessing this atrocity in live action. The next day, we went to the landing dock where they unloaded the interstate shipment of slaves, followed the path where the slaves walk. Next slides. We stood in the warehouse district where they kept the slaves before the auction. The streets are so clean now, as if the past had been all just washed away. But the air is full of history. After that, we went to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, where, the next slides, where we saw hanging steel beams. And this represents 480 counties where they located and identified victims of lynching. Each steel beam has victims' names and dates etched in. Facing these steel beams, all I saw was actual bodies hanging from the trees. The last thing we did was visit a garden where the women artists welded 3 African women in metals. Next slides. Their uterus were hollowed out. She did this to remind us that white gynecologists use slave girls' body to test drugs. I broke down and cried. Why am I telling you about this journey? Most of you probably already knew the stories. Why do you need to be reminded again? Some of you may say, forget about the history. There's nothing we can do about it. Of course, we cannot reverse the history, but we can learn lessons from them. Our lives didn't just start the moment we were born. What flows in our veins are the history and the footprints that our ancestors have left. Slavery in 1700, just like GI Bill in the 1950s, helped build white wealth. Now downriver, many modern whites benefited from this history. Some of you may say, why Europeans were not the only ones who enslaved people. Slavery seemed to be a very common practice throughout history. But just because everyone is doing it, it doesn't mean the perpetrator should be given a free pass. We might not be able to right the wrong everywhere, but we can at least make sure it doesn't happen here in this country again. Unfortunately, although we may not have the same kind of slavery now, but the years we spent in this nation's war on drugs didn't bring us any victory. Instead, it created mass incarceration of black and brown men. When you take that many men of color out of the economic systems, it not only caused the economic disparity between whites and people of color, it also created a permanent caste system. Now, from convert leasing in the history to the current use of prisoner labor, businesses have benefited from these cheap laborers. Don't forget the majority of the victims of human trafficking are women and girls of color. These are all forms of slavery. How can we say we're done with the history when history is still happening? The tour guide said we need to go home and find the Birmingham in our neighborhood. Sitting in a blue state like California, we tend to think we're immune to this bloody history, but we have our own racial history to deal with. Remember the sundown towns. Since 1800s, white employers pit one immigrant group against the other one for cheaper labor. Chinese and Mexican laborers were lynched in Los Angeles. The Chinese Exclusion Act was not lifted until 1950. How can we forget the Japanese internment camp? And what about the KKK movement in Orange County in the 20s? Bigotry and hatred are powerful kindling waiting to be lit just about anywhere. As an Asian immigrant, I've been in this country for over 50 years. Up to just a few years ago, I thought I had enough freedom to move around and live a peaceful life. But anti-immigrant sentiment never really died. On the streets, if you're not white, you're always suspect. Then the pandemic happened. When the term China virus was used, the number of Asian hate crimes started to rise. I was reminded I'm never safe. This is still not my country. And if China and the US ever go to the war with each other, what do you think is going to happen to someone like me? So you ask me why I need to wear raised lens so often. I want to know why you don't. For the whites not to wear raised lens is a privilege. This means thinking about racial issues is an option. They can pick it up, they can put it down. As a person of color, I don't have such a choice. An underdog constantly needs to be aware of their environment and hold vigilance for their self-survival. These underdogs can be people of color, women, or LGBTQ+ people, just to name a few. This is what the top dog doesn't have to spend any energy on. But if white folks said they want to fight for racial justice, they must wear the raised lens too. We UU have such a rich history of fighting for social justice. Activism has been in our DNA. We have considered ourselves renegades from any doctrinal religions and revolutionaries against any oppression. On the night of 2nd March from Selma to Montgomery, 3 UU ministers, James Reeb, Clark Olson, Ola Miller, were leaving an integrated restaurant when they were attacked by 4 men. Reeb suffered critical head injury from the beating. He passed away 2 days later. Nationwide protests were held in weeks after Selma. 5,000 were in attendance in Cincinnati at a rally that First Unitarian Church played a role organizing. In his eulogy delivered by Dr. King at Brown Chapel, he said James Reeb symbolized the forces of goodwill in this nation, and he demonstrated the conscience of this nation too. On March 25th, just a few weeks after Reeb's brutal murder, a UU member, Mrs. Viola Luzzo, was shot dead in her car on the highway when she was shuttling protesters between Selma and Montgomery. This history is in our vein as UUs. Look at what's going on right now. Continuous police brutality, abolishment of affirmative action for college admission, book banning, voting right restriction, attack on teaching a race theories, arguing that slaves benefited from slavery, the biased criminal justice system, and other oppressive systems against people of color. Racism is still alive in America. If we UUs take a pride in our progressive stance and our history of fighting for social justice, we cannot go to sleep at this point in our history and let our ancestors down. If these larger systemic issues are too overwhelming to tackle, we can certainly do something from where we are instead of wringing our hands on the sideline. We can start by increasing our awareness of how our racial identity has advantaged or disadvantaged our lives. We can also be active witness and call out the everyday racial injustice. We need to acknowledge that we cannot create a welcoming congregation for all races when we don't notice that the congregation was built on white norms that make whites comfortable. So to say the reason that we're having difficulty increasing the number of people of color in our congregation is that the UU's teaching is just too different from the spiritual background of people of color is too simplistic and can also be sounding a cop-out. For those people of color who have found UU, there must be something very attractive to them. So I want to remind us, back in the 60s, we did have a very large group of African American UU members. After the several UUA policy and practice change had broken the promises made to the people of color, they left and never came back. Some of us may wonder, why do we need 8th principle since we already have 7 principles? This is like when people ask why we need to promote Black Lives Matter when all lives matter. This question is, have we fully followed the 7 principles and operated as if all lives matter in our daily life? If the answer is no, then the 8th principle is created to be more direct and targeted to achieve racial equality that we say we want. We need to hold ourselves accountable. Accountability means the willingness to be held responsible for the results or the consequences of our action or inaction. So if we haven't built a truly just and equal world we aspire to have, what do we need to do? Whose work is it? To truly create a beloved community, we need to move from our head to our hands, to put our ideals to work. We need to move from passion to action. The 8th principle is about action and accountability. After we adopt this principle, the real hard work will have just begun. Do not make this into another banner. Coretta Scott King said, "Struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it, you win it in every generation." Talking about racism makes some white folks very uncomfortable, especially when they think they didn't personally own any slaves or intentionally harm anyone, so racism has nothing to do with them. Well, meanwhile, people of color are in agony, like me, standing here, sharing our trauma, picking the scab of our wound all over the place. We have a choice of going back to sleep, but things do not get better by themselves. Being awake is painful, but necessary. Instead of feeling guilty, ashamed, angry, or judgmental, I like to see well-meaning white folks use their emotions to mobilize their spirit and leverage their dominant position to make change happen. Please do not let people of color fight for racial justice alone. Shalom, amen, namaste, blessed be.